So we are very excited for this presentation because obviously you can't even say China's the elephant in the room because it's just out there. We're talking about it in every single session and for very good reason. So in this session, we are going to go deeper, and that is what our experts here are for. We have two academics joining us today. First, we have Chen Gang. He is Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the East Asian Institute at the National University of Singapore. There, he traces China's politics, foreign policy, and environmental and energy policies. And if you search him on Google Scholar, you can see he's published extensively on these issues. And we also have Yuan Mei, who is an assistant professor of economics at Singapore Management University. And he focuses on international trade, spatial economics, and development economics. So together, they are going to be talking about China today. They both have presentations. They're going to try to go through them relatively quickly to leave ample time for questions, because I know that this is a topic that no matter where you're from, it's something that you care about. So please join me in welcoming this morning's speakers.
All right, so I'll go first. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm Yuan Mei from SMU, and this is actually my first time presenting to a non-academic audience, so I'm not sure what is the optimal content to put on my slides. So, but let's see. And this is also my first time presenting while seated, so it feels new to me. Yeah. So today I'll present my thoughts on China's influence on international trade, and I'll start by talking about the rise of China as a important player in the global economy, and through international trade and the concept of the China shock. And then I'll talk about trade war, tariffs, and the role of World Trade Organization, the WTO. And lastly, I'll share my thought on some pretty interesting features of the trade pattern of China that are observed in the past few years. So here you can see the merchandise exports of selected countries in the past few years or past 2 decades. Here I put China, United States, Japan, and the United Kingdom. So here is only merchandise exports. So merchandise exports means the exports of clothing, electronics, raw materials, right? The tangible goods. And you can see that for US, Japan, the United Kingdom, there's still a kind of steady increase over these past 2 decades. In fact, US was not doing bad, but compared to China, China, the growth is just phenomenal. If you look at compare the year 2000 versus the year 2022, right? I think if I remember correctly, at year 2000 is like 0.6 trillion US dollars, 0.4, but in 2022 is like 3.6. So, and this happened during a relatively short period of time. That is pretty natural for the economists to consider this rise of Chinese merchandise exports as a shock. In fact, this idea or the concept of the China shock has been used extensively within academia. The concept of this term, China shock, was first used or popularized by this article the China syndrome, local labor market effects of import competition in United States is published in American Economic Review, one of the best journals in economics. And this particular article is probably the most influential academic article on international trade in the past 15 years. And this figure is actually taken from the article, showing that on one hand, we observe the pretty sharp rise of U.S. spending on Chinese imports, right? From 1991 to 2007, for example, it rises from like 0.06% to like 4.6%. During the same period of time, the working age employment in the manufacturing sector in the US declined by a third during the same period of time. So the three authors, all established economists, try to relate this change in US local labor market outcomes with the rising import competition with China, and they find this, right? This result, after using some pretty serious econometric analysis, they find that import competition from China explains 1/4 of the contemporaneous aggregate decline in the U.S. Manufacturing employment. So that's a pretty major result, and actually it's this finding has shaped U.S. policy or trade policy to some extent, right? So this is also taken from that article. The different colors is showing different the magnitude of the impact of the China shock. You can see that many affected areas are what we call the Rust Belt, like think about Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana. In the 2016 election, you know, those areas actually matter a lot that Donald Trump became the US president. And so before I move on, I want to emphasize that, you know, given those results from the China shock paper, it's pretty natural to interpret those results as trading with China is bad for the US. But economists generally don't believe that that's the right way that's the right interpretation. And that's because there are multiple other channels through which trading with China would benefit the US. For example, imports of China would reduce consumer prices in the US. You know, they are cheaper than locally produced, and you know, China also provides more varieties, right? Think about automobiles, your electronics. More varieties also matters to consumers. At the same time, U.S. export to China also create jobs, right? So, in fact, this paper actually find that this paper, Finstra, Ma, and Xu 2019 paper actually find that job gains due to U.S. export expansion to China after China joined WTO is more than enough to compensate the loss in the manufacturing employment, right? And lastly, China not only exports final goods, consumption goods to the U.S. consumers, but also intermediate inputs, parts and components. And in fact, global value chain or different stages of production, that has been an important feature of modern trade of the manufacturing sector these days. And because China is able to export a low-cost intermediate inputs to the U.S., that actually makes U.S. firms more competitive. Right? So on one hand, it's true that import competition of China have substantially hurt the manufacturing environment, employment in the U.S., but we shouldn't ignore these other channels through which trading with China actually benefits the U.S. All right? But unfortunately, those results from the China shock paper actually has been emphasized a lot, but other channels are not widely discussed outside academia. And what we observe afterwards, that's the U.S.-China trade war, right? After Donald Trump became the president, he raised tariffs on a wide range of Chinese goods from 2018 to 2019. So you can see from this figure, this is a timeline of the trade war compiled by the Peterson Institute of International Economics. You can see a clear timeline of how tariffs increased by US and China during that period of time. And you can see that before the trade war, the US tariffs on Chinese goods was actually pretty low. So at that time, the US trade policy was in general very liberal. Yeah, but after approaching the end of the trade war, the average tariff on Chinese goods is around like 20%. That's considered very high. All right, and then we can see that so at the beginning of the trade war, actually the US president at that time, Donald Trump, actually started this thing called tariffs on steel and aluminum. And this is actually not only targeting China. This is targeting all countries with initially only 4 countries initially exempted: South Korea, Argentina, Brazil, and Australia. But of course, later more allies of the US applied for exemption, and some countries got the exemption. Right? The legal basis is this act. US president is allowed to impose tariffs basically in times of or under circumstances as to threaten or impair national security, right? Whether you believe this is really threatening the US national security, that's not for economists to judge. But economists can tell you whether these tariffs on steel and aluminum is consistent with the regulations or the rules under the framework of the World Trade Organization, the WTO. And the WTO actually officially announced that such tariffs is actually inconsistent with the rules specified by the WTO. But it's pretty difficult to have any material impact or to enforce these rules, especially in recent years. And that's because the US has the power to nominate members of the WTO appellate body. But during the Donald Trump administration, the US had been reluctant to do that. So the appointments were not, but the process was not that smooth. So so the appellate body was pretty, it's pretty difficult to function. Yeah, so that's the Trump's tariffs on steel and aluminum. And right after this tariff surface, the Booth Business School of University of Chicago actually initiated a survey asking a bunch of leading economists in the US to respond to just one statement. New tariffs on steel and aluminum will improve Americans' welfare. Among more than 40 economists responded, 24% disagreed, 76% strongly disagreed. If you add the two numbers up, that's 100%. So that tells you guys how economists view the tariffs. And so here I just got some comments when the economists took the survey. Richard Thaler from Chicago, Nobel laureate, right? In that, we want more trade, not less, right? Oliver Hart, another Nobel laureate from Harvard. A robust result is that trade increases national income. The cases where this is not the case are rare and hard to spot. All right, Eric Muskin, another Nobel laureate from Harvard. I thought we learned our lesson with Smoot-Hawley. Smoot-Hawley is an act or law in the U.S. Signed by President Hoover in 1930, and it's about using protectionist trade policy to improve domestic employment after the beginning of the Great Depression. And economists mostly believe that it didn't work. In fact, it worsened the negative economic impact of the Great Depression. All right. And lastly, Ken Judd from Stanford. Tariff may help some Americans significantly, but the number is small, and the loss is usually much larger than the gains. Right. So here I'm just showing you how. Economists typically believe that tariff is not a good thing. All right, then we mentioned about WTO, and here are the number of WTO dispute settlement cases for selected countries, both as complainant and respondent. So you can see China actually, right after China joined WTO, China actually didn't do a good job and receive a lot of complaints. But overall, after that, within the WTO framework, China's performance was not that bad. Sometimes it's even above average. So I want to be clear here. Within the WTO framework, the WTO rules and regulations, China is not a bad student. Okay. Okay, next. All right, so lastly, I want to talk about some interesting trade patterns of the Chinese economy or Chinese the trade of China. So here I'm showing the composition of Chinese exports from 1995 to 2022. And you can see that in 1995, most of the Chinese exports are low value added and labor intensive, right? Think about clothing, apparel, toys, furniture, leather articles, right? So those things. In 2022, you can see that there's a substantial shift, right, to high value added, capital intensive goods like machinery, the parts and components used in the production of manufacturing devices. You can also see a pretty sizable box of cars, right? Think about EVs, right? This is a pretty important shift of the Chinese export composition. And I think you guys had a session of electric vehicles before, right? So here, what I want to emphasize is that China only it's not only a major player in the production of electric vehicles, but from the figure, you can also see that it's actually dominating the whole supply chain, right? Think about the battery cells, the components that makes the cells, right? The materials that are needed, the raw materials that needs to be processed to produce the cell components, and on top of the supply chain, right, the very upstream, the mining part, right? If you look at those red bars, right? So that is why when Joe Biden a few weeks ago raised tariffs on Chinese EVs, he had to also raise tariffs on all these things, right? Because you can make the Chinese EVs more expensive, but what about the Chinese battery cells, right? but in my opinion, that would make producing EVs in the US even more expensive, right? Making batteries more expensive, making the cell components more expensive, making raw materials more expensive, right? And lastly, all the slides before are about merchandise trades, the trade of goods and materials. What about service trades, right? Think about financial services, education, transportation. In this important category of international trade, U.S. is still the dominant player. China is kind of lag behind. You can see there's signs of picking up, but it's still very far away from the U.S. Right? So, what are the sectors that China is catching up? So this part, even in academia, there aren't as much research as merchandise trade because of the lack of data. But what I believe is that China is catching up in the e-commerce parts. This is app downloads of shopping platforms from Apple Store and Google Store, and you can see that two apps actually increase a pretty sharp increase in terms of downloads. That's Temu and Chen. Both are Chinese apps, and Chen is actually headquartered in Singapore, but the business model of both apps are just shipping products directly from factories in China to consumers, mostly in US. All right. So yeah, in conclusion, we have observed China shock, but we should be aware that the effect on the manufacturing employment is not the only channel. We should look at the whole picture. And economists generally do not like tariffs. And I talk about some trade patterns of China in recent years. And yeah, and that's it for my presentation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Any questions for Yuan Mei before we go to the next?
Yeah.
Thank you. This is fascinating. I'm Jia Hui. I work for Wall Street Journal, and I cover China macroeconomy. I guess I'm just curious when you said that China is trying to export more like high value added goods and services to the rest of the world. Like it just reminded me of this term by Xi. Recently, he raised that we want to invest more on 新质生产力, which is new productive forms, right? Like, what's your interpretation of this? Like, what are exactly he's trying to referring to? Because I think different economists and analysts have different opinions on that. So that's my first question. And secondly, I saw you have a working paper on electronic plugs. I'm just curious, like with US, EU, and now Canada are considering raising more tariff on China-made EUs. Like, what do you think of the future of Chinese EV companies? Like, are they gonna trying to expand overseas more aggressively? What would be their strategies? Because I think they already know like US-China geopolitical risk is a big factor affecting their business. So they didn't really put much emphasis on exporting to US market specifically, but EU is definitely a important market for them. Do you think it's gonna like lead to another trade war between EU and China? Yeah, so that's my questions.
Okay, great question. So the first question is about productivity, and I think it's important for China to. Okay, so this is my I hold a PhD degree from University of Chicago, and we believe that the government shouldn't intervene in the market much. So I personally believe that what the government should do is to just make sure there's good institution, good quality of the market, and let the entrepreneurs themselves to decide, what should be invested, what investment could boost up productivity. Because if you think about it, Temu and Shein, they are not like because of the government they are successful, right? So think about productivity. I think it's really important that the whole market quality should keep improving. That's the important part. And the second part for the electric vehicles industry, for the U.S. market, I think it will be very tough. For the Chinese automakers, maybe setting up factories in Mexico could be a way. Because if you look at the 80s, when the Americans have a relatively negative sentiment against the Japanese cars, what the Japanese automakers did, setting up factories in North America. So maybe there's a solution. And same for EU market, I think. So recently, the EU also announced some tariffs on the Chinese EVs, but those tariffs are very calculated. The EU people, they actually done a pretty thorough procedure to ensure that those tariffs are consistent with the regulations by WTO. Right? So if you look at the numbers, 17.1%. That must be done after some calculation, right? Unlike Joe Biden's 100%, right? So I personally wouldn't expect there's a large-scale trade war between EU and China, but for the electric vehicles, I think the tariffs might be there for a while. So maybe the automakers in China would also want to set up factories in Europe. Yeah.
I see. Thank you. One last question. With the coming third plenum meeting by CCP in July, is there anything particularly you are watching for? 三中全会.
I'm not. So I always. I think I as an economist always care about those economic policies most, but I'm not sure exactly there would be any major economic policy that come out in that particular meeting. Yeah.
Hi, I just have one question.
Okay.
My name is James from Bloomberg, and you were talking. I mean, generally, your opinion on tariffs and trade restrictions seems to be opposed. But if you look at, say, the Japanese investment into the US that you mentioned in the 80s, that came about as a direct result of the trade tensions and the US attempts to block Japanese car exports.
Yeah.
So Japanese companies, well, the US imposed voluntary export restrictions on Japan, or Japan agreed to that. That led to a massive increase of FDI into the US, which led to the direct creation of jobs and improved the US industry in that case. And then again, if you look at the Chinese auto industry, in 2014, they created the battery whitelist, which forced Chinese battery producers to become much more efficient and much more effective because they blocked foreign battery companies from selling into the Chinese market. And they've also until recently, forced foreign companies to produce and sell in China through JVs. So the Chinese and the Americans have both imposed trade restrictions, which have led to welfare effects in their domestic economies and created stronger, better export industries. So isn't it possible that US trade restrictions now or EU trade restrictions now will lead to the development of a better, stronger, cheaper industries in cars, but in also other sectors as well?
Yeah. So that's a great question. So I think 2 points. Firstly, you mentioned Japan. 40 years ago. Again, so here you are just focusing on the improved manufacturing employment in the U.S. And as I mentioned, we should look at not only that particular channel, but also other channels, particularly the consumers, right? So if I'm not saying that free trade is benefiting everyone, but in general, the aggregate outcome would be a positive one. And in that process, particular groups of the import competing sector might be hurt. So there's distributional consequences of international trade. So that's one thing. And the second thing, China is not a very good player in the WTO at the very beginning. So the first few years after China joined WTO, there has been quite a few cases complaining about China. But China received those complaints and China improved. And actually, many countries, including US, European countries, they have been happy with the WTO framework for a while. So I'm not saying that China has been always a good student, or China is is much better in the US in terms of practice of free trade. But my point is basically that WTO has been functioning relatively well. And all those disputes about unfair practices, about tariffs, maybe non-tariff barriers, WTO has rules about how to deal with those practices. So yeah, if we can go back and make WTO functioning again, so I think the situation would be better. Yeah.
One more quick question, and then I want to make sure that Chen Gang has a chance.
So yeah.
Hello, Zimia from South China Morning Post in Hong Kong, and I also cover China's macroeconomy, and I have two questions. So the first one is, do you think any practical measure to regain or rebuild trust between China and the West? Because what we are seeing right now is probably a force like industrial revolution. We are seeing more and more like driving force such as AI. And even industries are more like disruptive innovation in the future. And especially for China, it really like eager to climb up the value chain. You want to be in the developed economy club. And it's getting very intense, but do you see any possibility for both sides to regain trust? And my second question is, China has faced many disputes about like human rights violation and also like overcapacity issue. So I actually like 3 weeks ago, I talked to the former official of National Development and Reform Commission. So I asked, what could be the next 5-year plan? So according to him, like introducing this Chinese company to go to the West, to go abroad, like establishing factories, establishing like contributing to the local job creation could be the next target. Whether it wants or it is forced, it has to choose this. So do you think any possibility, or do you see any foresee anything like it could face in the future in this sense?
Great questions. The first one about trust. I don't think economists are good at answering questions like that. Maybe you media guys could do a better job than economists. Yeah, so that I really don't have much idea. The second one about overcapacity, this term has gained much attention after Janet Yellen's visit to China, right? So Janet Yellen is a great economist. She got I think she got tenure at Berkeley, wrote a lot of great academic articles, but my personal opinion, I don't think she has given a very concrete, clear definition of what is overcapacity using economic terms. So if you want to really address the issue of overcapacity, you should clearly define what is overcapacity, how to measure overcapacity. And as an economist, I haven't seen anything like that. So
there's a dispute, like there's a very strong dispute, because for a lot of Western analysts, like China's deliberately outpouring its cars, because right now for Chinese side, according to Chinese officials, it's not on purpose. The act is not on purpose, because a lot of the provinces, a lot of the manufacturers in China right now, they're actually engaging in an intense price war.
But think about it. If we can measure, we have a right measure, like the amount of exported vehicles relative to domestically sold vehicles. We can have, if we want to use that ratio as a measure of overcapacity, then that ratio for Japanese and Korean cars would be much larger. So that cannot be the definition of overcapacity, right? So yeah, that's my answer. All right. Okay, thank you very much.
So good morning. First, I'd like to thank Hinrich and the National Press Foundation for having me here. It's always a pleasure to engage with journalists. I'm from the East Asian Institute under the National University of Singapore. We are basically a think tank and a policy research institute. So that's why probably we have more engagement with the media, both local and international. And we also have very regular contact with Hinrich. And I like Hinrich focus on promotion of the free trade. So I do believe that free trade benefits everyone in the world, but it has to be done in a very fair way. Today, I think my colleague, Dr. Yuan Mei already mentioned that we are witnessing the second wave of China shock. And I think we have already read a lot of reports about that. And how to interpret, I think that's a key issue. Yeah, we have all the figures, all the charts. Yeah. So how to interpret, for example, the development of China's trade, export, import in the last few years? We know that Donald Trump imposed the tariffs on all kinds of Chinese products 8 years ago. And if we look at this chart, we can see that it has not been very effective because my focus is about the trade surplus. Yeah. Of course, if you look at it from the US, American perspective, it's a trade deficit, yeah, or other parts of the world. So basically, we can see that despite all the trade measures or other protective measures against the Chinese products over the past few years, China still managed to maintain its trade surplus at a very high level. So it has been disrupted by the early stage of the pandemic, but then it quickly rebounded through exporting the medical equipments when most parts of the world are badly needing those kinds of equipments. So many people thought China was an opportunist, grasping this kind of rare opportunity, but it will not last long. But what has happened after that has proven that actually China did manage to maintain its trade surplus. And now we can see that the surplus actually grew quite significantly from the level before the pandemic. So now we all know that China has other secret weapons, including the new three: the electric vehicles, the solar panel, and the batteries. So I think the key question is to identify, so what areas China are working on to further improve, to further boost its export and to increase its trade surplus. So I do see that the policy priority for China's trade is the surplus. It's not about export, really about the absolute term of export or the import, but to maintain the trade surplus. Because more than 3 trillion foreign reserve is vital for the Communist Party's legitimacy and its status in the world. So I identify this kind of surplus as a policy target or the priority for the Chinese trade policy. So you may ask this question: why Donald Trump or the US trade, the tariff does not really work? Yeah, it does not really reduce the surplus of China or the deficit from the US side. Yeah, so my interpretation is that China managed to boost its export, its production in many new areas. So that's why we are seeing the overcapacity discussion these days. Yeah, I do think that China does have serious overcapacity in many areas. Yeah, including the property sector as well. If you go to China, you see so many properties everywhere. Yeah, every household has more than 2, 3 houses. Yeah, so the production of everything in China is enormous. So the reason why China keep producing is that it wants to maintain the surplus, to keep its products cheap, and also to boost its competitiveness in the world. So you can see from this chart that whenever China's export growth rate is slowing down, it will also suppress its import at the same time to maintain the surplus at certain level. Yeah, so I think the key issue now for China and also for the whole world to reduce this kind of imbalance is to ask China to import more. So that's probably one of the few solutions to that. I do not think that China imports enough these days. It's exporting more and more, but it does not import enough. China still stick to the self-sufficiency strategy. So that's another, I think, key perspective for us to understand China's economy and trade. Yeah, although China has become the world's largest trader, its focus is about the self-sufficiency. So it's very ironical. Yeah, it's a global power, but it's also focused on its own indigenous capacity. So it wants to produce everything it needs. So it does not really want to rely on any foreign products. Yeah, of course they can import if necessary, if it complies with the cost effectiveness principle. But in the long run, whenever they regard it's a high value added area or it's vital for China's security, for China's economy, they will try to produce on their own. Yeah, so the cars definitely is a very good example. And in agriculture, you can also see, we know that China imports a lot in the agricultural area. Yeah, but they want to get more and more self-sufficient. For example, blueberries. Yeah. Before the pandemic, you went to China, you are not seeing Chinese consuming any blueberries, especially those grown on Chinese soil. But these days, you go to everywhere. Everywhere has blueberries. produced in many Chinese provinces. Yeah. So I don't know how they managed to do that, but the capacity there and the efficiency they are doing that is really, really surprising. But if China keeps doing that, I do not see that this kind of imbalance will be mitigated, and that would cause huge, I think, imbalance or even the backlash from other countries. So I do not see that this kind of trade growth is sustainable in the long run. Yeah. So China always blame that because of the protectionism or the populism in other countries, China cannot really have free trade with other countries. But I also think that China also needs to reflect on its own. Yeah, it needs to import more to reduce trade imbalance a little bit. Yeah, at least. Yeah. So if we look at the top trading partners with China, we can see that actually US is still very important for China's trade. Yeah. Of course, we look at the headlines of many media, we see that ASEAN has become the #1 trading partner of China. But ASEAN is a trading bloc composed of 10 countries. So if we regard the whole Southeast Asia as different countries, break them down, we can see that the US is still the largest trading partner with China country-wise. Yeah. EU is another trading bloc. And if we look at the export, China's export, we can see that actually the US is getting even more important. Yeah, it's actually the de facto largest exporting partner with China. So most of the Chinese products still are being sold to the United States. Yeah, so the largest market is still the United States. Of course, China is getting more and more reliant on Southeast Asia. Yeah, but much of the products from Southeast Asia to China are still the intermediate goods are for the East Asian supply chain. So the final products or the end products sold by China, shipped from China, are still to the United States or Europe. But we do see that China has a kind of strategic shift to Southeast Asia. Yeah, according to our research and also our interview, our engagement with Chinese officials, especially in the southern provinces, they told us that, for example, Shenzhen city, previously their main focus is United States, no doubt, and then Europe. But now, these days, they have been told that they should focus more and more on Southeast Asia. And not only the business people, but also the government officials, even scholars, academics, are being mobilized to help the Chinese supply chains to move to Southeast Asia. Yeah, so these days we are seeing some reports saying that actually China has to accept the fact that the supply chain is being moving out of China. But my understanding that China also voluntarily wants to do so. Yeah. But there's a limit for that. They do want to move some of the supply chains to other parts of the world, especially Southeast Asia or Mexico, but not all. They want to retain the high-end manufacturing, including the research and development within China. Yeah, I was told by local Chinese officials saying that. So previously was both ends out. I don't know whether you heard this or not. Both ends out means the supply chain, the high-end research and the final assembly actually are were out of China. And China actually was responsible for the main part of the supply chain. But these days, China want to do the opposite. Yeah, they want to keep the two ends inside China, while moving the main parts of the supply chain out of China because of the labor cost, high labor cost in China, and also because of the environmental concerns, and most importantly, because of the tariff. Yeah. So I think it's inevitable that we are seeing this kind of manufacturing outsourcing in the future. Yeah. So it's not only because of the US or European or Korean, Japanese companies want to do that, but also because Chinese also have the intention to do that. Yeah. So that would have significant impact upon future global economic and the trade structure. So we are still trying to assess the extent, to what extent this kind of supply chain centered on China would be moved to other parts of the world. But it seems that the process is pretty strong. Yeah. And it's still ongoing. Yeah, so we went to China. We tried to identify some new areas where China will boost its export. We already see the new three: the electric vehicles, or the batteries, or the solar panel. So you may want to ask the question: Will there be another new three after this? Will there be another China shock after this? Yeah. So our research is about identifying the new areas where China could have breakthroughs in boosting its competitiveness, in boosting its export. Of course, that would further worsen the trade imbalance globally. But our job is to identify, to look at those new areas, potential new areas. So one area I identify is the shipmaking. So you've already read some reports saying that China almost doubled its export of shipmaking, to other parts of the world. We went to a shipyard in Shandong, the Jinglu shipyard. I was so shocked. Yeah, they told us the business was extremely good, and they're building ships for all countries around the world. Yeah, Singapore ordered 8, I think, oil ships, from this single shipyard. And it's not the largest shipyard in China. And this shipyard, amazing, is building Chinese Coast Guard vessels and the Taiwanese fishing boat at the same time. It's strange, but it's true. They told me that ship actually is Taiwan. It's a Taiwan shipping boat for the Taiwanese. Yeah. They're also building they have the license to produce military-related ships like the Coast Guard vessels. Yeah. So they build all kinds of ships. Yeah. So I will not be surprised if one day we are seeing that this shipbuilding is included in another new 3. Yeah. In the next new 3. Yeah. Other areas, pharmaceutical. We also want to see some pharmaceutical companies in China. All the pharmaceutical companies in Jiangsu, Shandong, Guangdong, they all told us their business is good. Yeah, they're exporting pharmaceutical products, medical equipment to other parts of the world, especially the emerging economies. Yeah, the developing world. Yeah. Of course, they also have a cooperation with the United States, I think. Yeah, I cannot. Yeah, you can see that. Yeah. So the collaboration is still ongoing between China and the West, especially in areas like pharmaceutical or high-tech areas. I don't think I have enough time. Yeah. And another area may be this oceanic equipment manufacturing. Yeah, it's enormous business. Yeah, I cannot show you you can see this is the ocean farming equipment. So China is building more and more this kind of ocean related because of Xi Jinping's call for the development of 海洋经济, marine economy.